Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
My dissent is not your dissent, right? So the things where I have red lines are not necessarily going to be the same red lines for you, and we have to negotiate that. That there are going to be vast swathes of the population who'll go, AI, great, let's adopt as much of it as possible. And other swathes of the population will say, no, we'll reject as much as possible. And finding a guiding line through those two extremes that makes sense. I don't think it's possible to go completely backwards. You know, we're never going to get rid of AI in all our systems, but we can be as critically informed as possible and make our red lines really visible as well.
My name is Pablo Salmones, and I will be your podcast host. Today's episode is from an event in December 2024. During this episode, Professor Beth Singler discussed how AI is having an impact in different cultures around the world, as well as the philosophical implications of how we are representing the creation of AI in internet culture. Listen now to our conversation. Professor Beth Singler is the Assistant Professor in Digital Religions at the University of Zurich. Prior to this, she was a Junior Research Fellow in Artificial Intelligence at Homerton College, University of Cambridge, after being the postdoctoral research associate on the Human Identity in an Age of Nearly Human Machines project at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. Beth explores the social, ethical, philosophical, and religious implications of advances in artificial intelligence and robotics. She also has a few books, which we will talk about during the conversation as well. And as part of her public engagement work, she has also produced a series of short documentaries. The first, Pain in the Machine, won the 2017 HRC Best Research Film of the Year award. And well, she has just such a big bio, so I'm not going to read it all.
It's fine. Those are the top lines. You don't have to go into everything.
Wonderful. But as you can see, she's such a great guest. And so thank you once again, Beth, for being here. So perhaps we can start the conversation just by, asking a simple question. Well, why are you so interested in both AI and anthropology, like in, this entanglement that exists between both?
Yeah, I usually answer this in a shorthand by saying I'm a huge geek. So my first passion was science fiction literature, reading and also seeing, transmedia presentations, various different sci-fi programs, had a conception of what AI was before, the real burst of generative AI that we're enjoying at the moment. But grew up in the 80s and really enjoyed representations of androids and robots and cyborgs, Blade Runner and Star Trek and all these different interpretations, but then also had this fascination with religious ideas as well. From, as you say, the more anthropological perspective of trying to think about why people describe their beliefs in particular ways, what kinds of organizations they develop, the stories they build together. And those two things really only kind of ultimately clashed together, specifically AI, when I started my postdoc at the Faraday. I'd already been doing research from about 2010 into the conjunction of new religious ideas and social media, but it was the postdoc at the Faraday where they had a project they wanted to hire someone onto, and they were looking for, I assume, someone who could do the ethnographic work, the interviews, but also has the vocabulary of the science fiction that I had as well. So it seemed like a really good fit to bring those two things together. And since then, I'm just so fascinated with how these two things come together, that the assumptions are they are so distinctly different, but you can't take one from the other. I really believe that. So AI is embedded in the cultural context of religious ideas. And likewise, religions are now so enmeshed within a society that is so enmeshed with AI that all you can see is people using it or exploring it or refuting it, dismissing it, exploring ideas about what it's going to be, what it is now, the ethics. There's so much engagement between these two areas that every time I find someone who goes, those two things don't go together, which has happened to me quite often. I gave a very small, quick 5-minute presentation as a part of a science festival here in Zurich as part of the opening event. And afterwards, this gentleman came up to me and said, I didn't understand your presentation at all. I was like, I'm so sorry, I talked very fast and it's in English and this is Zurich. And he said, no, I don't understand it because religion is just beliefs. So what does it have to do with AI at all? And I just went, oh, okay, that's a big can of worms. And I could barrack you for the next hour talking about all the aspects of my research, but maybe it's best just to say that's your perspective, and maybe we can't come to an agreement on that. But there is this assumption these two things are so very different, or that religion is a very negative thing and can't be associated with something that's progressive and looking forward, like science and technology of AI. So bringing those two things together, I like to be contrary. I want to show people these two things really are quite entangled with each other.
It just reminded me of a quote by Ada Lovelace, which is one of my favorite polymaths, me being a polymath myself, but mostly in terms of music and engineering and all that. But precisely because she was, aside from being an eminent mathematician, she was also a wonderful theologian. And at some point, she was writing a letter, I believe, to Charles Babbage, where she was saying that there was, that people, were used to separating things instead of actually finding the things that they had in common, that she could write a whole volume about why mathematics and religion were so similar to each other. And so it just reminded me of that when you mentioned that, this idea that AI and religion, people see it as two different things, and they sometimes don't see this entanglement. I think that's, just reminded me of that quote. Now, something that I believe, I don't know, is your case of, being an anthropologist and having studied also kind of like different cultures. I do imagine that there might be a difference between how this entanglement is seen in different religions or in different cultures, right? Perhaps it's not the same way how people might see it there in Zurich, or how people might see it here in Latin America, or, in other parts of the world, in Asia or in Africa. What has been your experience with that? Do you see that entanglement that you're talking about right now present in every part of the world, or is it something that also depends on each culture and how each culture might address it?
As an anthropologist, I end up wanting to be as granular as possible. So you don't want to make big sweeping statements. We've had decades of people going, in the West, we think this way. In the East, they're more animistic, and there's like a techno-orientalism that comes in. And I try and avoid those kinds of sweeping statements as much as possible. And what I wanted to do in my book, where I have these three categories of the kinds of direct responses between religious or spiritual groups and AI, and I talk about rejection and adoption and adaptation, I try to make it very clear you can find all of those in an individual person at different moments. So I recently spoke at a conference in Oxford on dissent in a digital age, and it's interesting to me, as the anthropologist in the room, they were mostly theologians in the room, as the anthropologist in the room, that some people were very adamant about what they should dissent against in terms of AI ethics and surveillance culture, but then we're also using generative AI art on their slides, which I personally dissent against. So we all have our own moments of rejection and adaptation and adoption when it comes to AI. So to make those kinds of large statements about, Hindus would say this or Christians would say this is very problematic. But when you go to write a book like my recent one, I wanted to do case studies. So I had to find specific examples of, okay, here's Christian rejection, but here's also Christian adoption. And we can find such a variety of rich responses, which was why I started with entanglements. John Dewey says we start with things in their entanglements. We start with things that they're messy, it's difficult, it's complicated. And then, yes, for the nature of writing a book, you try and pass it out into chapters and case studies and comments and specific examples. But I think there's such a richness in different cultural approaches. Sometimes it's sort of the nature of AI itself that it reduces things down to simplifications. But if we start paying more attention to the granularity of people's cultural responses, it's not so simple.
Throughout the world, there is precisely the predominant view, if you will, is precisely this idea, right? For example, we say, well, the US or China are leading the AI revolution. And as you're saying, perhaps it's a good thing to be granular and identify even within these different countries that they have, there are different groups of people, different cultures. Certainly, there are very many different cultures here in Mexico, and I understand your perspective very well. Yet at the same time, I see that, in the everyday conversations, if you will, that people talk about these things. People say the US is leading this or China is leading this. But one of the things that intrigues me is that I find interesting, how do we actually take into consideration these different points of view of different people, particularly when bringing the religious perspective into the ethical discussion of AI? Because precisely what happens is, this is they say, okay, we're bringing these, let's say, for example, the Christian perspective or the Muslim perspective, and I can tell you that here in Mexico, we have, 30 different cultures, and each of them might have their own point of view. And even, they're not in granular terms, each person might have their own perspective. But how can we make sure that in something that's actually having an impact throughout the entire world, that we take into consideration these points of view that are sometimes overlooked? What sort of things these people in these cultures can contribute to the ethical discussion in AI?
It's a really good question because, as you say, there are some dominant narratives that seem to be stretching across the world. We want to seek this granularity, but there's a shaping effect of various charismatic authorities, and love him or hate him, and I'm on the hate him side, Elon Musk. And figures like him are shaping a dominant idea of this, the AI war, or, what kind of forms of AI we should have. This idea that China's leading or America's leading, and the combativeness that's going on in that narrative, or even the most dystopian narratives are still hyping up AI in particular ways. It's true, we need to have a diversity of voices in the conversation, and actually capturing that is very difficult. I'm one person doing anthropological work, and even when I'm doing digital ethnography and looking on social media conversations, it's impossible to catch up with everything all the time. Everything's always happening all the time, everywhere. So that's part of the difficulty, and we can only ever sort of do a virtual ethnography in that sense. So the word virtual has several meanings, and I mean both in the online sense, but also the virtual as in not quite capturing everything of reality. But that's the limitation we're always stuck with. I did recently another book called The Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI, and we tried very hard to get different perspectives, different research on different religious groups. And again, you have that limitation of chapters by group of religion. And even so, I shared the announcement about the chapters with someone, and they went, well, you didn't have a chapter on Sikhism. There's still gaps and lacuna we're always going to have in the limitations of the process of publishing. So maybe we think about different platforms for communication of different people's perspectives. I think a space like this is great. Obviously, at some point, I think we open up to questions, and that conversation can grow and spread. Digital technologies and platforms allow for more people to be engaged in the conversation, but we also have to be very proactive on figuring out who's not being involved, who's not being included. And a field like AI can be so demographically limited. The significant voices coming from very similar demographics. And likewise, even religious institutions have those issues as well. When you talk to people about engaging with a state or a governmental body, you have to look at how internally diverse it is. So the more that we can open up virtual spaces, I think the more we can actually draw some of these people into the conversation who haven't been included so far.
Yeah, you say sometimes it's difficult to, catch up with everything that's happening. I certainly think that's true, but I wanted to ask you, is it difficult to catch up with the actual progress of AI or with the different narratives? Because you just mentioned about this dominant narrative.
Yeah.
So is it difficult to catch up with progress or with the narrative itself, or a bit of both?
Yeah, it's both, certainly. I mean, the news reports will even put a spin on the technological advances. So if you wanted to keep up with the technological advances, you're still getting the narrative. You can't really entirely extract one from the other. Unless I suppose you're really at the coalface of the technological publications, which are kind of beyond me, to be honest. I can deal with the New Scientist or the BBC summarizes the latest advance, but I can't dig around in the actual processes that are being improved upon. So yeah, it is a process of seeing both in conjunction and trying to keep up with as much as possible what's going on. But being someone who's interested in the religious and spiritual aspects, those new religious improvisations are also part of what I'm trying to catch up on as well. New formations, new communities, whether they describe themselves as explicitly religious or not, and many do not, to be aware of what are the shapes of human conversation in this area as well. And that's a lot to keep up on.
And in fact, in one of your conferences, you mentioned something about will AI create a new religion? And then you mentioned some of these new religions that are, starting to pop. And I took my time to look for a couple of them, and it's quite interesting to, to say the least. I wanted to ask you precisely about these new religions that you've been mentioning in your work. What explanation do you have for these new religions? Is it just because AI is such a massive movement and someone decided it's worth creating a religion out of that movement, or is there a deeper philosophy behind these religions? Is it just something that's going to eventually disappear, or do you think they are here to stay? Or what's your assessment of these new religions that are coming up?
I'm going to answer that question briefly, very difficultly in a way, by saying yes and no. So in some ways, this is very old behavior. I've been studying new religious movements specifically since 2010. I didn't really move specifically to AI until 2016. So my background's in the study of new religious movements on social media. And in the history of studying new religious movements, scholars have long noted how technology inspires specific religious improvisations. So you can make a direct connection between something like spiritualism and the development of the telegraph, which gives people ideas about communication with people at greater distance, and then they extrapolate from that. And the element of knocking, doing the seance, the knocking sounds is related to the telegraph and how that works. So scholars of religion have been talking about how new religious movements are tied up with our imaginaries around technology for a really long time. So in a sense, AI new religious movements are following on in that tradition of being inspired by a new way of perceiving the world through technology. I think what might be slightly different, which is why I say it's yes and no, with AI new religious movements, what you've got is an engagement with a technology that talks back. So whereas the telegraph allowed you to talk to other humans, and then you conceived of talking to other humans who were dead through spiritualistic practices, with AI, you're talking directly to something that talks back and can have existential conversations with you. Now, of course, there's a long history of talking to non-human others in forms of religion and spirituality, so angels and fairies and spirits. But an argument I'm trying to make also in my work and in a recent paper with Murray Shanahan is that this technology sort of democratizes that spiritual expression. So anyone now can do the same experiment that Murray Shanahan did for this paper that we did, where you just have an existential conversation with Claude. You put in a couple of jailbreak prompts and then see what comes out, and you have explore what the content is. Anyone can run that and make their own interpretations. And that's slightly different to a history of saying, through a specialized technology or through a specialized individual, someone can have access to this spiritual experience, this religious moment. So some of these AI new religious movements are not just perceiving that AI will at some point become godlike. They're already exploring the idea that it has access to spiritual realms in a way that exemplifies perhaps some of their existing philosophies already.
I don't know. I'm not that familiar with these new religions, the formation of new religions. But what is it like if anyone can have access to this, or if anyone can actually do all this experiment, for example, the one that you just mentioned, or if anyone can have access to this technology that talks back? I imagine it's very appealing to some people, but it might also be, some people might say, well, why should everyone be able to do this? Or why should anyone be able to do this? Is there not supposed to be someone who can actually guide me throughout the entire process of, this new religion? But how do you see that? Do you see this idea of everyone being able to do this as something that will appeal to a lot of people, or that it will also, that will make some people take distance of these new religions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm quite a Weberian in my thinking, that I tend to follow his ideas about charisma and routinization. So into established religious forms, you get these eruptions of charismatic moments where people seek, again, a rebirth of the direct experience. And they start, we have the priest class and the prophet class, and you start seeing emergences again of the prophet figure. And over time, according to Weber, it then becomes routinized and becomes formalized, and you get structures and institutions. So in a similar sense, some of these people who are experimenting with chatbots right now and having these eruptive moments of religious experience are going to formalize this. We see very nascent forms of that now. There's various different groups who name themselves. They have institutions and collective structures. And so that process just begins again and again in that view. So re-enchantment and disenchantment of the world at that very smaller scale. Whether this erupts and has a larger effect, or perhaps we just perceive a more general implicit religiosity in the discussion about AI, it can be both. You can have the smaller, more discrete groups with their own priest class, whatever they want to call themselves, and then the more implicit religiosity we see around the general conversation of AI. So you're right to a certain extent. I do think some groups will become more formalized. They will have internal schisms, the same sorts of repeating patterns you see in many other new religious movements and religions more historically as well.
Do you think that AI will somehow have an effect in democratizing access to, let's say, knowledge, to spiritual knowledge, in these different religions. We've had that discussions, for example, with, there are certain things that are allowed in some religions, some are forbidden, some don't allow you to draw, for example, a particular god or something. What effect do you think it will have in bringing that knowledge or bringing that spiritual knowledge perhaps to different religions? Again, knowing that, as you mentioned, you're not going to make these sweeping statements, but the general effect,
Yeah.
what do you think that will be?
Yeah, so I talk about this a bit in my book, in the chapter on adaptation, and there's shifts and changes in access to information when you start using AI as a user interface, which we see more and more with various different large language models and GPTs, that institutions, religious and otherwise, are already using this as a way to give knowledge to people, not always with the concern about misinformation and disinformation that perhaps is necessary. And it's usually when something goes very wrong, like when Father Justin, the chatbot, recommended baptizing babies in Lucozade, then they defrocked Father Justin. He was meant to be a Catholic priest, and they took away his dog collar and just put him in a suit. So that effort to see how AI might become a way for disseminating knowledge about particular religious traditions can be a part of this democratization process. Whether it's going to be successful, I'm not sure. Like with Father Justin, we keep seeing cases where if it doesn't produce misinformation or disinformation, it's just not got the guardrails that are necessary when individuals have spiritual or religious conversations with them. So there's a particular one at the moment that was in the press in The Guardian, Jesus AI chatbot. It's been in Lucerne here in Switzerland. We thought about talking with them about bringing it to Zurich, and the questions there about the ethical problems that come up when you put a chatbot with a representation of Jesus's face, because they have an avatar image as well, and you put people in a confessional booth and allow them to interact with this AI, and they have disclaimers about this is a performance piece, but without concern about what kinds of questions people might ask and what kinds of answers they might get. That kind of user interface is very risky. But institutions are going to see the possibilities in adapting to this technology and bringing it on board, that it gets a lot of attention. As I said, there's been press coverage of this particular AI. There was other examples last year, like the Nuremberg sermon, where you, again, have an avatar system. And it does get a lot of attention because a lot of people are sort of already bought into the hype of artificial intelligence. So they want to see it in action as much as possible. And they're primed for that. As I said, I'm a geek. I love science fiction. People are primed from a very early age, if they pay any attention to science fiction, to see AI in a particular light and to see it as something rather miraculous in its sense.
Yesterday I was on a TV show, and I was telling them that AI is like this new party, right? Like we're just getting to the party, and all these questions about, well, what's going to happen is like, I don't even know who I'm going to dance with. I'm just arriving to the party, and let's see what the party is about. I think that it's such a big party that we have everyone on board, right? In the sense that previous parties perhaps did not have as many people or as many institutions, having an opinion on all of this. That is the blockchain party or something, might not have had the same effect that this is having. In part, I believe, due to language itself and, the words that are surrounding artificial intelligence, and that term by itself, I think it has a lot to do with this. At the same time, it brings up the question of, well, who's responsible for that party, right? And you mentioned in part of your work, the AI creation meme, this image that has become just part of our daily lives, about the hand of the robot, touching the hand of the person. And I mean, you have obviously a very deep work on that area, and even talking about the different positions of the hands and all of that. At the same time, it just brings up precisely that question: to what point or to what extent are we responsible? And of course, who is that we? Is it we as a society? Is it we as institutions, as governments? Again, who's responsible for the party, and how do you think we should address that responsibility when coming up with these new images that perhaps are much, much stronger, have a much deeper effect than even the original creator, perhaps the original creator of these images, that is thought of when coming up with them?
It's such a powerful image. It's almost impossible to avoid in some spaces. When I was picking covers for my books, and the publisher will send you to a stock image site, not only were the majority of things AI generated, but quite a lot of the search results for religion and AI would be some version of the AI creation meme, which I absolutely did not want after writing about how it can be very problematic because, aesthetically it's interesting and it can start a conversation. But for a lot of people, that's, their first perception perhaps of what's happening. And if it gets sold in the light of all that affective baggage of a creation moment, it really takes away some of the reality. It's wonderful, and I say I'm a sci-fi fan. It's wonderful to explore the aesthetics of AI and robots, but as you say, with the question of responsibility, if we oversell the mythology of it, we don't see who's behind the curtain. The Wizard of Oz is another wonderful metaphor for this, right? There's some great work by people like Joanna Bryson on how the selling of the personification of AI is a complete distraction away from the corporate responsibility. We've never had this problem really with other technologies. We haven't really identified so strongly with a creation moment for things like the car. We have wonderful ads and marketing that tell us we should feel a particular way about our experience in a car, but there's very few that try and sell it as a companion. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so I can mention Knight Rider, where it was also artificial intelligence, but we don't have this kind of romanticizing of the creation moment in other technologies. And I think it is a little risky to fall too much into that narrative. You can explore it a little bit in science fiction when you know you're paying attention to science fiction. When it becomes very dominant in the world of science fact, it obscures the human labor in artificial intelligence, the environmental cost of artificial intelligence, the human responsibility, both at the corporate level, which you mentioned, but also our individual responsibility in how much we accept AI as an efficiency tool, how much we surrender to a future where it's assumed that human workers are less efficient and less useful than artificial intelligence. I've skipped over to Blue Sky recently. I'm abandoning X. On Blue Sky recently, someone posted an image of a poster from a corporation saying your human workers are going to come in late, but AI will never do this. So we're already blasting out this message. We have to be there to say how much we accept and how much we dissent to. And as I mentioned that conference earlier on dissent, one of my starting points was to talk about the use of generative AI art in the actual posters for the event. And to say one of the things I thought through in my initial kind of very visceral reaction to that was, my dissent is not your dissent. Right. So the things where I have red lines are not necessarily going to be the same red lines for you. And we have to negotiate that there are going to be vast swathes of the population who'll go, AI, great. Let's adopt as much of it as possible. And other swathes of the population will say, no, we'll reject as much as possible. And finding a guiding line through those two extremes that makes sense. I don't think it's possible to go completely backwards. We're never going to get rid of AI in all our systems, but we can be as critically informed as possible and make our red lines really visible as well.
You also mentioned that we need to be cautious when it comes to kind of like overselling all of this. My question is, how do you actually bring that idea to everyday people? Sometimes all these different discussions, like the one we're having right now, which is it's just wonderful. I mean, it's great, and everyone here is very interested in all these different topics. That's wonderful. But how do you bring all of this to everyday people? How can you actually give them that message of just be careful with this? Like, it's great, use it, or whatever, but just try to be a bit careful with it.
I mean, it's a public engagement question, right? Because you mentioned I made a series of short films or documentaries with a team of documentary makers, and we tried for something that was quite, neutral in a sense of trying to show both sides of here's the dystopian, here's the utopian, here's the hype, try and unpack all that with expert voices. To scale that was very difficult. At the same time as our second film came out, in America, a film came out of, I think it was Berkeley, with Stuart Russell called Slaughterbots, which went straight into the attention-grabbing dystopianism of drones will come and automatically kill you because they got facial recognition software. So if you're trying to do public engagement, sometimes, unfortunately, you're sort of fighting up against the more hyperbolic stories about existential risk or utopianism, everything's going to be great. So that is a difficult element. I do think, to go back to your analogy of the party, people can come in and make their own choices, right? They can either drink the punch as much as they want, even if you warn them it's very alcoholic and they might fall down afterwards. But what you can also do is have had a conversation before they even went to the party, when people are children, and say, as parents do, and I'm a parent, you try and prepare your kids for some of the choices they're going to make later on in life. And I think this is also a choice To a certain degree, we're still going to have top-down pressures, but also grassroots responses are really important. So if we can talk to people as they're growing up to make good decisions in this area, and that definition of good is variable, but at least to think through the critical process of, is this what I want? Is this what I want for my family? Is this what I want for my community, my society, and scaling outwards? Then perhaps they're a little bit more prepared. It is difficult also at that level. I recently gave a talk at my son's school, and I hadn't realized, it's been a while since I was at school, but I hadn't realized quite how gender separated the audience would be. They self-selected into two groups of girls and boys, and they were like 16, 17 years old. The girls were very well behaved. I'm not making gender generalizations. This is what happened. The girls were very behaved, had excellent questions, and the boys were rowdy and asked silly questions. When that's your effort at public engagement and they're not engaging back again, or they're making silly questions or whatever, that makes it very difficult, and that doesn't scale up. I can't do 1,000 schools talks a year. I would die. But we can think about, as I mentioned earlier, but this is a great platform for engaging more people because it's digital, more people can join. We can think about other spaces. There are festivals. I mentioned science festivals I speak at. Greenbelt last 2 years, we've had some really great strands on AI and different speakers. There are many other science festivals where, conversely, Greenbelt is a Christian festival, but conversely, you might take spiritual perspectives to science festivals as well and say religion is actually a part of this conversation in a science-focused space. We can all try and engage in that scaling up from the individual to the community to the society as a whole in public engagement on this subject.
I don't want to finish without asking you precisely about education and about kids. Things are changing, right? And the entire ecosystem is changing. And, just a few months back, we had a guest. He was telling us the best definition of technology I've ever heard, which is technology is everything that came after you were a kid, after you were young. I thought he was just right about that. I loved that definition. Now that you gave this talk at your son's school, and in general, how do you think that these younger generations will start addressing the AI questions, and how are they growing up with all of this?
Yeah, I like the suggestion that, technology is whatever you came after you were born. Like we're constantly running the risk of falling into moral panics about technology. And, you emerge into the period of the internet for the first time and people freaking out about the desktop computer. I've got a wonderful selection of images of prior moral panics, including a picture from, I think it's the front cover of Time magazine with the title, The Tyranny of the Telephone. But they're talking about the desktop phone with the cable in offices, how this would interrupt people's working days. So we have to be careful not to fall too quickly into those sorts of ideas. But yes, going back to what I said earlier about spiritual experiences and AI, this can be something distinctly different because it speaks back to people. And we see this in the communication between younger people and artificial intelligence, that it's giving them sometimes something that's missing socially and emotionally. So I'm sure people have seen these horrible stories recently of a chatbot that they deny it convinced a 14-year-old child to commit suicide, but a chatbot that certainly created a narrative space in which that child thought it was the best thing to do. So, they're trying to obscure responsibility. This is a concern, absolutely. My son is nearly 13 and he sometimes says to me, can I just play with ChatGPT? Can I just mess around? I was like, I'm not sure. You do understand about misinformation and disinformation? So, yes, Mum, you're very boring. You've told me this several times. So there's this sense of the shiny toy moment, but also we have older kids here. Obviously, they're not really kids at the university level, students who are being given so many conflicting messages about AI as well. It's the shiny toy in some of the conversations still, even at the university level, where some universities are running prompting courses to encourage people to use ChatGPT to learn how to use it better. And then they're also giving over accounts of, when you go out into the world of work, you're going to be expected to work with AI. So we better prepare you for that future world, so that the university narrative is that direction. Well, they're also being slapped on the wrist if they ever use it to write essays. So there's contradiction all the time. So I wouldn't be, too keen on the moral panic mode, but I'm also very concerned about the messiness of the messaging. And I said, as an anthropologist, the messiness is where I love to live. But as a parent, it gets very worrying very quickly. So I can wear more than one hat. So I don't necessarily see a really strong through line in our education systems. I come predominantly from the UK system, and I know certainly for my son, there's been no messaging about what's appropriate to do with AI and what's not appropriate to do. I don't know the Swiss system as well. My son's in an international school, but worldwide, I think there is a lack of clarity in the education system. And I think it's only going to get worse because all I can see is education being defunded. And sorry to everyone here from the States, I can see that particularly there, but also in Europe as well.
Thank you so much once again, Beth. It's been an honor, and then see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming along. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today and also for having joined us throughout the year. On behalf of everyone at AI and Faith, we wish you a wonderful end of 2024 and a great beginning of 2025.